The deep earth hummed a ceaseless lullaby, a low thrumming that resonated through the very bedrock of my sanctuary. Here, within the cool, damp embrace of the abandoned mine, I found my truest solitude. The entrance, long collapsed and now reinforced with steel and concrete, sealed me away from the world's clamor, creating a perfect crucible for my obsessions. My workspace, a cavernous chamber once carved for ore extraction, had been meticulously transformed. Harsh industrial lights, suspended from the soaring rock ceiling, cast a clinical glare upon the rows of bespoke shelving that lined the rough-hewn walls, overflowing with scrolls, codices, and brittle tablets. Air purifiers whirred softly, a constant, mechanical breath against the ancient stillness, ensuring the delicate preservation of the impossible texts I dedicated my life to. For years, I, Arthur, had delved into the linguistic abysses, drawn to the fragments of human expression that defied every known rule. Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Mayan glyphs, Rongo-rongo scripts, all were familiar playgrounds. But my true fascination lay with the outliers, the anomalies, the Voynich manuscript, the Rohank codex, the Rongo-rongo boards that held no discernible linguistic family. These were not merely undeciphered, they felt undecipherable, as if born from a logic alien to human thought. The air, cool and metallic, was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a perfume of forgotten ages. My fingers, stained with ink and the residue of ancient pigments, danced across a glowing digital interface, juxtaposing images of weathered vellum against holographic projections of clay tablets. Hours bled into days, marked only by the automated delivery of nutrient paste and the flickering of the overhead lamps. Sleep was a concession, a brief descent into the subterranean darkness of my small cot, only to be pulled back to the shimmering screens and the silent demands of the texts. Determination was a fire in my gut, a relentless drive to find the thread, the connection, the underlying logic that the academic world dismissed as mere coincidence or elaborate hoax. I had always believed that language, in its purest form, was a window into the collective consciousness of a people. But what if a language existed that spoke not of humanity, but of something else entirely? A truth so fundamental, so universal, it transcended culture, era, and even species? The first hint had been a subtle echo, a recurring series of graphical motifs in a set of pre-dynastic Egyptian funerary texts. Initially, I dismissed it as stylistic convention, a shared artistic sensibility. But then, a similar arrangement of strokes, a peculiar angularity in the sequencing of symbols, surfaced in a collection of Olmec carvings from Mesoamerica, texts separated by millennia and continents. My heart, a relentless drum against my ribs, quickened its rhythm. Coincidence, I reasoned, a trick of the eye. Yet, the feeling persisted, a prickle at the nape of my neck. I began to catalog these specific visual signatures, not as decipherable words, but as abstract patterns. My algorithms, meticulously refined over years, cross-referenced every known impossible text, every disputed fragment, every cryptic inscription that had ever crossed my path. My eyes, weary but unwilling to yield, scoured the intricate displays. Each matching sequence, each structural resonance, was highlighted in a pulsing crimson. And then, it happened. A single, undeniable thread began to weave itself through the disparate tapestries. It was not a word, not a phrase, not even a symbol. It was a structure. A specific, nonlinear arrangement of elements, a fractal-like repetition of specific graphical relationships, utterly devoid of any known human grammatical or semantic logic. It appeared in the Egyptian texts, a ghost in the glyphs. It manifested again in the undeciphered script of the Indus Valley, a whisper in the seals. And then, impossibly, in the geometric patterns woven into the fabric of a Peruvian burial shroud, and even in the enigmatic scratches on a piece of polished obsidian unearthed from an ancient Mesopotamian site. The crimson highlights on my screens began to converge, forming a complex, interconnected web. The pattern was not random. It was precise. It was deliberate. And it was everywhere. This was not a shared human subconscious, a universal archetype. This was something far more profound, far more terrifying. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, the cold metal frame pressing into my spine, my gaze fixed on the overwhelming convergence of data. This was not an academic discovery. This was an intrusion. A signature, undeniably alien, woven into the very fabric of human history, a constant, silent presence. The texts were not merely conveying information, they were receiving it, or perhaps, transmitting it. And I, Arthur, had inadvertently become its conduit, its unwitting interpreter. The abandoned mine, once my refuge, now felt like a cage, its ancient stone walls pressing in, holding me captive with a truth too vast, too monstrous, to comprehend. A tremor ran through the earth beneath my feet, or perhaps, it was only within me. My lamps, a constellation of focused beams, cast long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls and the overflowing shelves. Dust motes, ancient and undisturbed, glittered in their artificial glow, a silent galaxy orbiting my singular obsession. Days bled into nights without the sun's tyranny to mark their passage. My internal clock, once a precise instrument, had long since surrendered to the rhythm of my work. The air, cool and metallic-scented, carried the dry whisper of turning pages, the rustle of vellum, the faint earthy tang of ancient clay tablets. Around me, the relics of forgotten tongues lay open, their glyphs and cuneiforms and pictograms awaiting my gaze. I moved among them, a solitary cartographer of the mind, mapping the untamed wilderness of human expression. What began as a flicker of curiosity, a fleeting anomaly in a Sumerian epic, had blossomed into a consuming fire. I had catalogued it first as a peculiar phonetic sequence, a string of seemingly nonsensical syllables recurring in a ritualistic chant. An isolated incident, I told myself, a vestige of some local dialect or a scribal error. But then, an almost identical sequence, structurally inverted, surfaced in a crumbling Byzantine manuscript, embedded within a sermon on divine grace. My brow furrowed, a hairline crack appearing in the edifice of my academic certainty. I found myself tracing the contours of the pattern like a blind man reading Braille, my fingertips ghosting over the unfamiliar terrain of shared human experience. It wasn't a symbol, not a glyph, but a structure. A specific arrangement of semantic weight, a peculiar cadence, a subtle inflection of meaning that transcended linguistic families. It appeared in the lamentations of a forgotten African tribe, woven into the narrative fabric of their creation myth. It echoed in the austere pronouncements of a forgotten Mesoamerican codex, buried deep within astronomical observations. It was a phantom limb of language, felt but unseen, a presence that defied grammatical classification. My initial rationalizations were a fortress I built against the encroaching strangeness. A universal archetype, I reasoned, a deep-seated human response to the ineffable, manifesting unconsciously across cultures. Perhaps a statistical fluke of staggering proportions, a cosmic dice roll landing on the same improbable sequence again and again. I even considered a grand, undiscovered proto-language, a linguistic ancestor so ancient its echoes still resonated in disparate tongues. Each explanation, a desperate incantation against the rising tide of the inexplicable. Sleep became a grudging necessity, brief descents into dreams filled with the rhythmic pulse of unseen vowels and consonants, a silent, internal chant that mimicked the deep earth's hum. My meals, haphazard and forgotten, were pushed aside by the growing stacks of texts I pulled from there. Climate-controlled archives. I was forging something here, or perhaps something was forging me. It wasn't just similar, it was identical in its underlying architecture, its profound, alien logic. It wasn't a shared human archetype, it was too precise, too intricate, too unfamiliar. It transcended the evolution of language, the accidents of history, the vast chasms of geography and time. A signature that no human hand could have penned, no human mind conceived. The realization, slow and insidious, began to curdle in my gut. This wasn't a discovery of human connection, not a testament to shared consciousness. It was something else entirely. And now, through my relentless pursuit, through my singular devotion, it had found its way to me. I was not merely an observer, I was becoming a lens, a conduit. The pattern was not just information, it was an invitation. And I had accepted. My work, an obsessive delve into the impossible grammars of pre-human civilizations, demanded this hermetic existence. Stacks of aged parchments, microfiche slides, and digital facsimiles littered the heavy steel table that served as my primary altar. The air, thick with the scent of damp rock and old paper, was a balm to my overtaxed senses. For weeks, the patterns had been coalescing. A repeating fractal geometry, an impossible syntax, shimmering just beneath the surface of disparate texts, Sumerian clay tablets, forgotten runic carvings, even the margins of medieval illuminated manuscripts. My mind, a crucible of linguistic obsession, had been the only vessel capable of perceiving its subtle, insidious presence. My eyes, perpetually strained, traced the elegant, terrifying curves that seemed to whisper of something vast and utterly alien. Then, the whispers began to escape the page. It started subtly, a phantom echo. The low, consistent thrum of the mind's ventilation system, usually a comforting drone, began to resolve itself into a rhythmic pulse. Not just a hum, but a subtle beat, a complex cadence that seemed to mirror the intricate patterns I'd been deciphering. I paused, pen hovering over a brittle fragment of papyrus, and cocked my head, listening. The sound was just a fan, pushing stale air. I told myself it was fatigue, the brain's desperate attempt to find order in chaos, a common auditory hallucination for the sleep-deprived. I pushed the thought away, dismissing it as the overactive imagination of a scholar teetering on the precipice of a breakthrough. Later, as I brewed a pot of strong black tea on the small electric burner, the hiss of the heating element seemed to form fleeting phonemes. My hand trembled, splashing hot water onto the cold metal counter. I stared at the rising steam, half expecting to see the delicate, terrible latticework I knew so intimately woven into its ephemeral tendrils. Only steam, of course. Just steam. My breath hitched. My focus was becoming too sharp, too precise, my mind too attuned to the minutiae of patterns. This was the price of such profound immersion, I reasoned. My intellect, a tireless engine, was simply overheating. The visual bleed followed. A glint of light off a damp rock face, for a split second, seemed to form a perfect arc of the pattern. The condensation on a rusted pipe, when I glanced at it too quickly, momentarily resolved into the familiar, terrifying glyphs before my conscious mind reasserted its reality, showing only water droplets. I rubbed my eyes until spots danced behind my eyelids, a futile attempt to scrub away the persistent phantoms. My determination, once a steady flame, flickered with a nascent unease. This was more than just overwork. This was a deeper intrusion. The dreams, however, were the true invasion. The patterns, once confined to the page, now writhed and pulsed in the blackness behind my eyes. They weren't static glyphs, they were living things, shifting, reforming, speaking a language not of words but of pure, unadulterated sensation. I would hear the echo of the mind's hum, but it would be twisted, elongated, a guttural moan that resolved into the same intricate rhythms. They weren't just seen, they were felt, a resonant vibration deep within my bones, a pressure behind my eyes that threatened to shatter my skull. I woke abruptly, gasping for air, the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. Even awake, the patterns lingered, faint afterimages on the periphery of my vision, a persistent hum at the edge of my hearing. I could almost taste the geometry, feel its strange syntax pressing against my consciousness. It was a suffocating intimacy, a sense of being observed, not by eyes, but by a presence that understood the very structure of my thoughts. I paced the small, makeshift laboratory, my boots crunching on loose gravel. My determination, my scholarly resolve, was being tested. This was merely stress, a prolonged siege on my psyche. I was seeing what I wanted to see, hearing what I expected to hear. My mind, stretched taut by the enormity of my discovery, was playing tricks. It had to be tricks. My only companions were the flickering lamps, the stacks of ancient texts, and the relentless, gnawing pattern that consumed my waking thoughts and haunted my dreams. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My skin, once pale, now held the translucent quality of a cavefish. My eyes, perpetually strained, were bloodshot maps of sleepless nights. Yet, a feverish energy propelled me. Each scratch of quill against parchment, each digital scan of a crumbling scroll, brought me closer to the heart of the enigma. I ate when hunger became a physical ache, slept when exhaustion claimed me, but always, my mind returned to the interwoven threads, the impossible designs. I traced the glyphs from a Sumerian tablet, their angular forms echoing in the marginalia of a medieval alchemical manuscript. I cross-referenced the strange, repeating motifs found in a forgotten language's burial rites with the architectural blueprints of an ancient, impossible city. It wasn't about meaning, not in the way words held meaning. It was about connection, about an underlying skeleton visible only to eyes trained to see beyond the surface. The pattern wasn't a language. It was something far more fundamental, a series of relations, an instruction set for reality itself. I had spent weeks fixated on a particularly stubborn sequence, a series of interlocking symbols that appeared in a Babylonian star chart. A fragment of a lost Mayan codex, and, most unsettlingly, etched into the inner surface of a hollowed-out meteorite I'd acquired from a collector who spoke of it only in hushed, fearful tones. Each instance was subtly different, a variation on a theme, like a single note played on different instruments. I slammed a fist down on the rough-hewn table, sending a cascade of loose papers fluttering to the damp floor. I stood, pacing the small, lamplit cavern, my breath fogging in the cool air. The hum of the mind seemed to intensify, a low, resonant growl. Then, a sudden, blinding clarity. It wasn't a linguistic key I needed, but a spatial one. I saw the symbols not as flat representations, but as projections. I took the digital scans of the three documents, overlaying them, not by matching their written forms, but by aligning the spaces between them, the negative areas, the implied connections. My fingers trembled as I manipulated the holographic projections, shifting, rotating, until a perfect, impossible congruence snapped into place. It wasn't a glyph, or a word, but a structure. A lattice of pure relation, a geometric framework that defied every principle of Euclidean space. My mind reeled, struggling to contain the influx of information. I saw lines that curved back on themselves without intersecting, planes that folded into higher dimensions, angles that summed to more than a circle, yet somehow formed a complete, closed system. It was a blueprint for impossible physics, a description of space that could be simultaneously vast and infinitesimally small, a reality where cause and effect were fluid, where proximity was a matter of conceptual alignment, not physical. Distance. My breath hitched. It wasn't just abstract theory, it was a feeling, a visceral understanding of how such a thing could be. My vision blurred, the familiar cavern walls seeming to warp, to ripple like water. The stable, solid rock around me felt suddenly flimsy, a thin veil over something vast and utterly alien. This wasn't merely a discovery, it was an unveiling. The pattern wasn't describing something distant, it was describing here. It was a skeletal framework for a reality that was pressing in, bleeding into the edges of my own. My brilliant breakthrough was not an understanding of a foreign concept, but a horrifying recognition of an encroaching truth. I had not merely deciphered a segment, I had, perhaps, opened a door. And I was standing in its threshold. The deep earth, my silent confessor, had hummed its ceaseless lullaby for days, its low thrumming resonating through the very bedrock of my sanctuary. Here, within the cool, damp embrace of the abandoned mine, I found my truest solitude, yet the patterns I had unearthed pulsed with a rhythm that defied isolation. They whispered of connections, of threads woven through disparate ages and cultures, a tapestry too vast for one mind to comprehend alone. It was an invitation. My determined pursuit of knowledge, once a solace, had become an obsession, a frantic gnawing at the edges of reality. The need to confirm, to deny, to understand if others had seen what I saw, became an unbearable weight. The mine, for all its protective quiet, felt suddenly too small, too confining. I gathered my notes, the carefully transcribed symbols and impossible glyphs, feeling their strange weight in my hands. The world outside, with its mundane clamor, beckoned with a desperate hope, a fleeting chance that perhaps I was not entirely alone in this peculiar awakening. The journey from the mine was a blur of discomfort and unfamiliar light. My eyes, accustomed to the muted glow of my lamps, winced at the harsh sun. The cacophony of passing vehicles and human voices felt alien, a chaotic symphony that jarred against the silent harmony of the patterns I carried within me. I plunged into the digital labyrinth, then into the dusty physical archives of forgotten universities and private collections, searching for echoes, for whispers of similar obsessions. My queries were oblique, framed in academic terms, speaking of anomalous linguistic overlaps and prehistorical semantic drift. Most responses were polite dismissals, academic condescension veiled in scholarly jargon. But a very few, were different. They pointed to the fringes, to names whispered in hushed tones, to works relegated to obscure special collections. One name, in particular, recurred, an elderly professor, long retired, known for his controversial theories on metalinguistic resonance. His address led me to a narrow, crumbling house tucked away on a forgotten street, its windows like rheumy eyes staring out from beneath heavy, moss-laden brows. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like distant static. The professor himself was a study in brittle age, his frame stooped, his sparse white hair a halo around a skull-like face. His eyes, however, held an unnerving clarity, a piercing intelligence that seemed to have witnessed too much. "You speak of patterns," the professor rasped, his voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves. He gestured to a towering stack of yellowed manuscripts on his desk, each page covered in intricate, looping script. "Specific patterns, you say? Not mere coincidence, but a signature?" I presented my own findings, carefully laying out the photographic reproductions of the ancient tablets, the medieval manuscripts, the colonial-era diaries, each bearing the indelible mark of the impossible glyphs, the unsettling symmetry. I spoke of the linguistic anomalies, the shared semantic roots that defied all known evolutionary pathways. As I spoke, his gaze never left my face, a strange, knowing glint in his eyes. "Yes," he finally breathed, a sound like air escaping a punctured lung. He reached a trembling hand toward my documents, his fingers hovering above a particularly intricate symbol. "I've seen these. Not precisely these forms, no. But the underlying structure. The intent." He leaned back, a faint tremor running through his thin frame. "They surface, you see, like veins of an unknown or in disparate geological strata. Always the same composition, though the surface manifestation changes." My breath caught in my throat. "You mean others have found them?" "Oh, others have found things," he corrected, a wry twist to his lips that did not reach his eyes. "And some have been found by them. This knowledge. It is not for us. It is a key, Arthur. A key to a door best left sealed." He tapped a gnarled finger against one of his own manuscripts, a script that seemed to writhe on the page. "I spent decades chasing the echoes. The impossible connections. I thought I was charting a new linguistic frontier." A shiver ran through him, profound and involuntary. "I was merely tracing the contours of a trap." He looked at me then, his gaze heavy with an unspoken sorrow. "You are determined, I see it in your eyes. The pursuit is intoxicating, isn't it? The sense of being on the precipice of a monumental discovery. But understand this, young linguist, some discoveries are not meant to be made. Some patterns are not meant to be completed. They call to us, these things, like a siren song." He offered no grand revelations, no names, no specific locations beyond his own stacked papers. But the confirmation, however oblique, resonated deeper than any direct pronouncement could have. He had seen them. He understood. There was this shared delusion, or shared revelation. His words, though few, had been a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was secured. He had seen them. The weight of that shared dread settled upon me, a suffocating blanket woven from ancient fears. Back in my study, the world outside my window seemed to dim, as if the very light itself recoiled from the unspoken knowledge I now carried. The air grew thick, not with humidity, but with an unseen pressure, a hum just beneath the threshold of hearing. It was the pattern, I knew, no longer content to merely exist on brittle parchment and crumbling stone. But they grew, coalescing from the ambient sounds, forming an indistinct chorus. My fingers, tracing the familiar lines of a Sumerian tablet replica, would pause, sensing a phantom vibration beneath the clay. My vision, too, began to betray me. The intricate geometries of my research notes would shimmer, the ink bleeding into ephemeral forms that pulsed with a faint, inner light. The grain of my wooden desk would warp, the whorls of the timber momentarily rearranging themselves into patterns eerily reminiscent of the glyphs I now saw everywhere. A shadow cast by a stack of books would deepen, solidify, then stretch into something impossibly long, a fleeting, angular presence that vanished the moment I blinked. The most insidious change, however, was the sensation of being utterly, irrevocably watched. It was not the feeling of human eyes, but something vast and ancient, a presence that pressed down, not from above, but from within. My thoughts, once my own sanctuary, felt invaded, not by specific ideas, but by a pervasive otherness, a resonant echo that vibrated with alien intent. Sleep, once a welcome oblivion, became a torturous landscape of fractured images and disembodied sounds. The distinction between dream and waking reality blurred, each bleeding into the other until I could no longer trust the ground beneath my feet. The deteriorating clarity of my mind, ironically, sharpened a strange instinct. It was a compulsion, a primal urge to seek out a place where the veil between what is and what should not be was thinnest. My research had occasionally hinted at such convergence points, locales of geological anomaly or ancient, forgotten ritual. One such reference, a fleeting mention in a forgotten local history of unusual seismic activity and strange disappearances, kept surfacing in my fractured thoughts, the abandoned mine. The old pickup truck rattled and groaned, a mechanical counterpoint to the growing chorus in my head. The entrance yawned before me, a jagged maw on the side of a hill, framed by skeletal trees. Stepping into the abandoned mine was like descending into the throat of the earth itself. The air was thick and still, heavy with the metallic tang of ore and the musty breath of ages. They were louder here, insistent, seeming to claw at the rock walls, to slither through the narrow passages. I felt the vibration in my teeth, in the soles of my feet, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the very bedrock. My headlamp beam danced over rough-hewn timbers, ancient and groaning under the immense weight of the mountain. The feeling of being watched intensified, pressing in from all sides, a crushing presence that threatened to collapse my skull. It wasn't just my mind being imprinted now, it felt as if my very body was becoming a canvas for something vast and alien. I stumbled forward, my breath catching in my throat, my determination warring with a primal urge to flee. The rock face before me, illuminated by my trembling light, seemed to breathe. The natural striations of the stone began to undulate, the mineral veins pulsing with a faint, sickly luminescence. And within that pulsing light, for a terrifying, eternal moment, I saw it, not a form, not an image, but the pattern itself, manifesting as a living, shifting tapestry of impossible angles and non-Euclidean curves, vibrating with an ancient, malevolent intelligence. It was not merely superimposed, it was within the stone, within the air, within me. I was no longer merely observing the pattern, I was becoming part of its terrible design. I needed to escape its imagined scrutiny, to dive deeper, to understand the truth that was tearing at the seams of my reality. My vehicle, a battered sedan, groaned under the burden of my obsession, carrying me away from the city's muted glow. The entrance to the abandoned mine was a maw of rusted metal and splintered timbers, a skeletal gateway to an underworld. I wrestled with a corroded gate, its hinges shrieking a protest that echoed into the vast, indifferent landscape. Stepping inside, the air thickened, heavy with mineral dust and the ghost of industry. I descended slowly, my boots crunching on loose scree, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the profound quiet. Deeper I went, until the last vestige of the sky's pallid light vanished, and I was encased in an absolute, crushing black. I found a relatively stable alcove, a pocket of dry air where the timbers seemed least rotted. Here, by the flickering light of a battery lantern, I spread my impossible texts, the Mayan codex fragments, the medieval alchemical diagrams, the strange, looping symbols from a forgotten Siberian shaman's drum. They were all there, laid out like offerings on a makeshift table of upturned crates. The patterns, once a fleeting glimpse, now seemed to throb beneath the surface of every inscription. My fingers traced the lines, my eyes devouring the impossible symmetries. It was more than a language, it was a geometry of thought, a calculus of existence. The academic sphere had been correct. This wasn't merely information about an entity, a description encoded in symbols. No, I realized with a gasp that stole the air from my lungs, the patterns were the entity, or rather, its signature. It was like seeing a single, impossibly complex cell and understanding it was the very blueprint, the very being, of a colossal organism. The glyphs weren't just representations, they were conduits, tendrils stretching across time and space. My perception began to fray at the edges. It was as if the patterns on the page were bleeding into my surroundings, altering the perceived reality of the abandoned mine itself. Then, the true horror blossomed. It wasn't communicating to me. It was communicating through me. My mind, my very consciousness, was the medium. The subtle alterations in my vision, the resonant hum, the creeping sense of the mind's walls breathing, these weren't external phenomena. They were internal. The entity was not merely informing me of its existence, it was informing my existence. My reality was being rewritten, perception by perception, by the very act of deciphering its signature. My thoughts were no longer entirely my own, threads of alien logic, perfectly interwoven with my own reasoning, began to emerge. I was becoming a lens, a conduit, a living bridge for something that sought to extend itself into this dimension, using the subtle, insidious act of comprehension as its vector. And the process, I understood, was far from complete. The weary academic's oblique confirmation had not brought solace, it had merely sharpened the edges of my burgeoning terror. My determination, once a steady flame, now flickered wildly, threatening to consume the very wick of my being. I felt the pull, an insistent hum beneath the skin of reality, drawing me deeper, further from the familiar. Sleep had become a forgotten country, its borders sealed by the constant, low thrum of the pattern. My body, a mere vessel, moved with an almost automatic grace, guided by an invisible hand. The mirror showed a stranger, gaunt cheeks, eyes like burnt embers in a skull, hair matted and wild. Hunger was a distant memory, thirst a dull ache easily ignored. Only the compulsion remained, a singular, driving force. Its entrance was a jagged maw, half swallowed by overgrown brambles and ancient, crumbling timber. I descended into its echoing blackness, a single lantern swinging in my hand, its frail light swallowed by the immensity. My research materials, a haphazard stack of copied texts, notebooks, and stray parchment, lay scattered on a makeshift table of upturned crates in a cavernous chamber. The air here was heavy, still, as if time itself had stagnated. I wrote, my pen scratching furiously, a desperate attempt to capture the fleeting thoughts that no longer felt entirely my own. The glyphs. They are not symbols, but echoes. Resonances. A language of pure presence. I scrawled, the words appearing on the page, yet their meaning felt borrowed, a fragment of another consciousness passing through mine. My fingers, stained with ink and grime, trembled. Was this my revelation, or was it merely the pattern's voice, amplified through my own intellect? The line blurred, a shimmering haze between what I was and what I was becoming. My notebooks, once meticulous records of linguistic analysis, had transformed into feverish testaments to fragmentation. They were the same symbols I had extracted from the ancient texts, but now they flowed from my hand, unbidden, a spontaneous expression of a knowledge I didn't consciously possess. Amongst these arcane designs, my own desperate pleas sometimes surfaced, like trapped insects. Who is speaking? Is it me? The distinction between my thoughts and the pattern's influence became an increasingly futile battle. I would begin a sentence, an observation about a particular linguistic nuance, and it would twist, warp, ending with a concept so vast, so utterly non-human, that it sent shivers through my very core. My own identity, once a solid construct of intellect and ambition, was fracturing, dissolving into the pervasive hum. I was a vessel, yes, but the liquid within was slowly eroding the clay. My gaze snagged on a particular section of rock. Here, the natural striations and crystalline growths seemed to coalesce, not randomly, but with an uncanny regularity. It wasn't carving, nor erosion, it was as if the rock itself had grown into a specific design. And there it was. Not etched, but inherent. A repeating motif, subtle yet undeniable, mirroring the most complex and disturbing of the symbols I had copied from the ancient texts. It was the same alien geometry, the same impossible angles, woven into the very stone. The pattern wasn't just written on parchment or carved into forgotten monuments, it was embedded in the earth, an ancient, primordial signature. A sudden, horrifying clarity pierced through the haze. The pattern was not merely information, it was a fundamental constant, a law of existence I had mistakenly sought to interpret. It wasn't something I could study and understand, it was something that was. And by engaging with it, by allowing its resonance into my mind, I had become a part of its unfolding, not an observer, but a component. My will, my sense of self, was not being overwritten, it was being integrated. I was not Arthur, the linguist, I was a node in a vast, incomprehensible network, a conduit for something that had always been, and would always be. The trek to the abandoned mine was a blur of frantic purpose, my vehicle devouring the miles of crumbling asphalt. The skeletal remains of a hoist mechanism, a twisted iron sculpture against the sky, seemed to beckon me into the gloom. My flashlight beam cut a fragile path through the dust-choked air, illuminating timbers bowed with age, their surfaces furred with ancient mildew. Each echo of my boots against the uneven rock floor seemed to stretch, distort, then vanish into an unnatural stillness. It began subtly. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the anomaly persisted, a shifting, inky stain that defied the simple physics of light and surface. Then, the geometry itself began to betray me. A support beam, perfectly straight a moment before, now appeared to curve inward at its center, then outward at its ends, a gentle, impossible arc that made my stomach churn. It felt straight, solid, yet my eyes screamed a different truth. The illusion was so potent, so utterly convincing, that for a moment I questioned the very sensation of touch. The mine shaft narrowed, and the air thickened, becoming cloying, almost viscous. The walls around me started to breathe. Not with the subtle expansion and contraction of living things, but with a slow, deliberate undulation that sent shivers down my spine. The rock faces, once rough and solid, now seemed to ripple like water, their textures flowing into impossible tessellations. I saw patterns emerge, complex and alien, not carved or painted, but inherent to the very substance of the stone. When I pushed myself upright, the tunnel ahead had changed. The perspective warped, the far end of the tunnel appearing closer than the near, then receding into an infinite distance within the span of a single breath. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the conflicting visual data, attempting to force the image into a comprehensible form, but it resisted, a stubborn, terrifying defiance of all known spatial laws. I pressed on, driven by a desperate, morbid curiosity. My breath hitched in my throat as the impossible architecture intensified. Pillars of stone emerged from the ceiling only to plunge into the floor beside them, without ever meeting the ground. Archways formed and dissolved, their keystone angles shifting, becoming acute, then obtuse, then utterly non-existent. It was a landscape born of pure nightmare, a realm of impossible angles and shifting dimensions. I saw vast, cyclopean cities built upon inverted mountains, their spires piercing a sky that was not sky but a swirling vortex of deep, bruised colors. Geometric forms unfolded and refold, revealing vistas of colossal, silent mechanisms, gears grinding without sound, their purpose unknowable. It pulsed, a living, breathing glyph that permeated every impossible structure, every warped landscape. This was it. This was the realm the texts hinted at, the place beyond human comprehension. I was not merely seeing hallucinations, I was seeing through. The veil between realities was thinning, and I, Arthur, was the conduit. The world around me, the solid, dependable world, was merely a veneer, and beneath it, this otherness throbbed, waiting. It was using me to bring its realm here. The impossible geometry was not just a vision, it was a blueprint. The chill of the abandoned mine was a physical presence, a frigid hand clamped around my throat the moment I stepped past the rusted grates. I had driven for hours, chasing the last vestiges of twilight into the deep country, seeking a silence absolute enough to drown out the screaming patterns in my mind. The academic's quiet horror had been a contagion, infecting my every waking thought, pushing me towards this echoing maw. I needed to be utterly alone, away from anything that could be touched or tainted by the creeping geometries. The mine shaft stretched before me, a hungry maw carved into the earth, its timbers groaning softly under the immense weight above. Each step dislodged loose gravel, sending it skittering into the unseen depths, a sound that amplified the profound solitude. I clutched the tattered leather-bound journal, its pages now filled with my own frantic scribbles, the impossible patterns meticulously copied, analyzed, and ultimately, internalized. They were no longer just ink on paper, they were etched into the very architecture of my perception. I found a relatively stable alcove, a small recess where the rock seemed to hold its breath. Here, amidst the dripping water and the deep, resonant hum of the earth, I laid out my meager tools, the journal, a few pens, and a desperate, burgeoning resolve. The silence was not empty, it was pregnant with a nascent dread, a hum that resonated not in my ears, but behind my eyes. They shifted, even on the page, the lines seeming to pulse with an internal alien light. I tore at a page, the brittle paper protesting with a sharp rip. But the moment the fragments separated, the pattern on it seemed to expand, to ripple outward from the torn edge, bleeding into the blank space, coalescing anew. It was not merely an image, it was a fundamental truth, a self-generating logic. The act of destruction was an act of propagation. I looked up, my gaze sweeping across the rough-hewn rock walls. And there, in the subtle undulations of the stone, in the way the moisture beaded and ran, I saw them. The patterns. Not drawn, not etched, but inherent. They manifested in the fractal branching of a mineral vein, in the precise angle of a geological fault, in the rhythmic drip of water into a shallow pool. They were not merely found in the ancient texts, they were the scaffolding of existence itself, revealing themselves through my awakened perception. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. It was here. And I, Arthur, with my deciphered patterns, my open mind, was the unwitting anchor. The bridge. My work, my ambition, had not merely revealed a truth, it had invited one. I tried to close my eyes, to shut out the encroaching geometries, but they were already behind my eyelids, shimmering constellations of impossible angles. Unlearn, I commanded myself, my voice a ragged whisper in the vast emptiness of the mind. Forget. Erase. But how does one unlearn the fundamental truth of the universe, once it has been revealed? How does one unsee the skeleton beneath the skin of reality? The patterns were not external, they were internal, a new operating system installed directly into my being. Every thought, every memory, every sensory input was now filtered through their impossible logic. I was trapped. Trapped within my own mind, within this abandoned mind, within a reality that was no longer entirely my own. The reckoning was not something I could stop, it was something I had become. The wind, a ragged breath, tore at my coat as I stumbled towards the gaping maw of the abandoned mine. My hands, raw from frantic packing, clutched a heavy duffel bag. Inside, a lifetime of work, now a death sentence. This was where it would end, I decided, my resolve a brittle shield against the burgeoning terror within. I had chosen this place for its isolation, its profound severance from the living world. The mine entrance, a collapsed maw of rough-hewn rock, yawned before me, shadowed and forbidding. Inside, the air grew still, the wind's howl replaced by the drip-drip-drip of unseen water, an ancient clock marking the passage of moments I no longer wished to count. From the duffel bag, I pulled my notebooks, the countless pages of transcribed symbols, the meticulously cross-referenced historical documents, the photographs of impossible carvings. I stacked them on a slab of fallen rock, a macabre altar. The first page caught, curling into a black crisp, then a tiny flame began to dance, hungry and bright. The smell of burning paper was acrid, mingling with the earthy tang of the mine. This was it. Sever the cord. Break the connection. Watch the evidence turn to ash, and with it, the insidious grip on my mind. My eyes, stinging from the smoke, watched the precious work transmute into nothingness. But then, as the last remnants of a crucial decipherment turned to ember, a flicker caught my peripheral vision. On the rough-hewn rock face beside me, where the light from my fire danced, I saw it. The very signature I had spent years uncovering, now etched into the ancient stone itself, a natural vein of quartz, perhaps, or merely an illusion born of my strained mind. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it remained, subtly shifting, breathing with an unseen rhythm. The patterns were not confined to the ink and paper, the digital files, or the fragile structures of human language. They were everywhere. I looked down at the pile of burning pages, and the smoke, swirling upwards, seemed to twist into the familiar, impossible geometries. The dripping water, catching the firelight, formed ephemeral, shimmering versions of the symbols on the cavern floor. It wasn't merely information I had found, it was the fundamental truth of the universe, woven into its very fabric. And more terrifyingly, it was woven into me. The unlearning was impossible because the pattern was not something external to be destroyed, it was the new operating system, installed directly into my being. Every thought, every memory, every sensation was now filtered, shaped, and informed by its relentless, alien logic. A sudden flash of light behind me, a car approaching the mine entrance. Headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating my desperate, smoke-stained face. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the night sky. "Arthur? Are you in there? I saw your car." It was a colleague, the historian from the university, his voice laced with concern. He had tracked me, likely worried by my erratic disappearances. "Get back!" I shouted, my voice raw, cracking. The words tasted like ash. "Don't come any closer." He hesitated, a briefcase clutched in his hand. "Arthur, what's happening?" "There have been strange things. And your research, the university is asking questions." "The university knows nothing." I snarled, my eyes darting from him to the shimmering patterns on the mine walls. He couldn't see them, not yet. But if he came closer, if he lingered, the entity would find him. It would use him too. "Leave. You don't understand what you're interfering with." "You're not making sense," the historian replied, his brow furrowed with a mixture of fear and academic curiosity. "The pattern itself. And now I'm trying to save you. Go! Before it finds you. Before it becomes you." He stood there for a long moment, a statue of incomprehension and alarm. Then, slowly, he backed away, his face a mask of bewildered horror. The vehicle's tires crunched on the gravel, then faded into the distance. I was alone. Utterly, irrevocably alone. The abandoned mine, my chosen tomb for the research, had become my prison. The escape had failed. The patterns were no longer just on the walls, or in the smoke, or in the dripping water. They pulsed within my very bloodstream, the rhythm of my heart now a drumbeat for the entity. I had tried to destroy the external manifestation, but the internal one was immutable. I was the pattern, and the pattern was me. And through me, it was now inextricably woven into the world. There was no severing the connection. There was only becoming. The detective's tail lights bled into the night, then vanished, leaving me suspended in a silence far deeper than mere absence of sound. It was the hush of a world holding its breath, waiting. My own breath hitched, a ragged thing in my throat. The darkness that descended wasn't just the lack of light, it was a physical weight, pressing in, urging me towards an inevitable conclusion. My hands, trembling but resolute, gripped the steering wheel. The engine coughed to life, a pathetic protest against the profound pull that now dictated my every movement. I drove, not towards escape, but towards the heart of the enigma that had consumed me. I glanced at my hands, and for a terrifying instant, my fingers seemed to lengthen, their joints articulating at angles that defied anatomy, the skin shimmering with an unseen luminescence before snapping back to their usual, mundane form. A trick of the light, I told myself, but the tremor in my chest betrayed the lie. The journey was a descent into a landscape reshaped by my perception. The air grew thick, not with fog or dust, but with a palpable pressure that seemed to squeeze the very breath from my lungs. It was the weight of an approaching presence, a vastness that dwarfed thought, a thing I had unknowingly invited into the fragile confines of my reality. Finally, the skeletal remains of the hoisting works loomed against the horizon, stark and menacing. The abandoned mine. I parked the car, its engine dying with a shudder that echoed the tremor in my own bones. Stepping out, the ground beneath my feet felt strangely pliable, as if the very earth was softening, preparing for a change. The wind, when it stirred, carried not the scent of pine or damp earth, but a faint, metallic tang, like ozone mixed with something utterly inorganic. I walked towards the mine shaft, my footsteps heavy, each one an act of surrender. Not light, but form. Impossible angles coalesced from the black, shimmering with a faint, internal phosphorescence. My consciousness was a fractured mirror, reflecting shards of meaning. Arthur, I thought, trying to anchor myself to the familiar, but the name felt foreign, a forgotten word on a dissolving tongue. Linguist. Scholar. These identities were dissolving, melting into the swirling patterns that now filled my vision, not just outside, but within me. The rock was part of me, and I, part of it. Deeper I went, drawn by an irresistible current. My own thoughts became a cacophony of overlapping languages, impossible glyphs, and the resonant hum of something vast and indifferent. I saw my reflection in a stagnant pool of water, and the sight sent a tremor of bewildered horror through my dissolving self. Then, I found it. A chamber, not carved by human hand, but grown. Its walls were not rock, but a pulsating, organic crystalline substance that defied classification. It hummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in my teeth, my bones, my very soul. It was a nexus, a confluence, a gateway. The entity wasn't merely influencing me, it was reforming me, using my physical self as a template, an anchor for its own impossible reality. As I stared at the pulsating core, a final, desperate surge of my original self fought for purchase. No, I thought, or tried to think, but the word dissolved into a cascade of alien symbols. The chamber pulsed faster, brighter, and the air crackled with an energy that threatened to tear me apart. This was the event. My physical form twisted, convulsed, no longer under my command. My bones groaned, my skin stretched, my vision shattered into 1,000 impossible angles. The impossible geometries I had only perceived were now manifesting through me, around me. I was no longer Arthur, the linguist. I was a threshold, a living bridge, my body a conduit, my mind a fractured echo, a thin membrane between realities, stretched taut, almost to breaking. The assimilation was complete, and I was merely the space where two worlds touched. The darkness that descended wasn't just the lack of light, it was a hungry, palpable thing, a silence woven with the unraveling threads of my own mind. The path ahead, or rather, the lack of one, beckoned. My vehicle, a borrowed, rattling contraption, coughed its way down a crumbling track, its headlamps carving tunnels through the ink. The trees, gnarled and skeletal, clawed at the sky, their branches like twisted fingers pointing the way. I was heading into the maw of the earth, to the abandoned mine, a place where the veil between what was and what could be thinned to a membrane. The entrance loomed, a jagged tear in the hillside. Rusting tracks, long overgrown with tenacious weeds, disappeared into the black maw. The corrugated iron gate, twisted and mangled, hung half off its hinges, a silent scream of abandonment. Every instinct screamed for retreat, for the sanity of the open road, but a deeper, more insidious current pulled me forward. It was a beacon, a lure. I stepped through the broken gate, the crunch of loose gravel under my boots echoing like gunshots in the sudden, cavernous quiet. Water dripped, a ceaseless, maddening cadence somewhere deeper within. The walls were rough-hewn rock, seeping moisture, streaked with mineral deposits that glinted like malevolent eyes in the meager light. Then I heard them. It was the same sound the patterns made when they coalesced in my mind, but amplified, distorted, imbued with a suffering so profound it threatened to shatter my resolve. The beam of my flashlight wavered, its weak glow dancing over the uneven tunnel walls. They were there, in the seams of the rock, in the pooling water on the floor, in the very air. Not ghosts, not specters, but echoes, distortions. They were human once, I knew, or had been. Their forms were stretched, elongated, their limbs too thin, their joints bent at impossible angles. Faces, oh God, the faces. Some were featureless, smoothed over like eroded stone, others were a riot of misplaced features, eyes where mouths should be, mouths stretched into perpetual, silent screams. Their skin, where visible, seemed to ripple, to shift, as if caught in an unending process of reformation. One figure, half embedded in a crag of rock, seemed to twist towards me. I saw the remnants of a human posture, a hand reaching, but the fingers were too many, too long, ending in blunt, calloused pads that suggested not touch, but an eternity of scraping. Its mouth, a jagged tear in the lower face, emitted no sound, but the internal shriek I felt reverberating through my own skull was its voice, a silent, endless agony. These were the others. The conduits. The ones who had followed the pattern, who had opened themselves to the entity, just as I had. And this was their fate. Trapped. Not dead, not alive, but perpetually becoming, their bodies and minds warped into alien forms, their sanity long gone, replaced by a constant, agonizing transformation. They were the entity's discarded vessels, its failed attempts, eternally bound to the place where their reality had been breached. This wasn't just observation, it was a premonition. I was seeing my own reflection in their twisted forms, a glimpse into the future the entity had planned for me. No. Not me. Not yet. I would not become one of them. I would not be another twisted echo in this subterranean tomb. I would fight it, understand it, and somehow, by some impossible means, sever this connection before the transformation became irreversible. I took another step forward, into the suffocating presence of the others, into the heart of their eternal nightmare. My legs, those brittle stilts of bone and protesting muscle, had given out, depositing me onto the cold, unforgiving earth. I was a husk, a withered leaf clinging to a dying branch, yet within me, a stubborn ember still glowed. It was the last flicker of the linguist, the scholar, the man who had once believed understanding was a shield against chaos. Now, understanding was the very blade that flayed me. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp rock and forgotten time, a metallic tang that clung to my tongue. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled for the lantern I knew the detective had left near the entrance, a final, cruel courtesy. It illuminated nothing but the immediate, crumbling path ahead, making the vastness beyond seem even more absolute. The descent into the abandoned mine was a slow, agonizing crawl. The walls, slick with condensation, pressed in, their rough surfaces scraping against my outstretched hand. It was the frequency, I knew, the same impossible pattern that had haunted the ancient texts, the same signature that had woven itself into the fabric of my sanity. My mind, a fractured mosaic of half-memories and terrifying insights, struggled to piece together the final fragments. The patterns, once a source of intellectual fascination, now writhed before my inner eye, not as symbols on a page, but as the very structure of reality itself. They pulsed, shifted, reformed, hinting at geometries that defied earthly logic, at connections that shattered the boundaries of cause and effect. I reached a wider cavern, its ceiling lost to the feeble reach of my lantern. Water dripped from unseen fissures, each splash a tiny, amplified drumbeat in the profound quiet. Here, the hum intensified, a low thrum that vibrated through the rock, through my teeth, through the very blood in my veins. It was not a sound, but a presence, vast and indifferent. And then, the revelation, not a sudden flash, but a slow, creeping dawn of absolute horror. It was not malevolent. It harbored no ill will, no conscious desire to harm, no intent to destroy. It simply was. Like the crushing weight of a collapsing star, or the silent, inevitable drift of a galaxy, its existence was a fundamental force, utterly devoid of human concepts of good or evil. My deciphering had been a delusion, a scholar's arrogance. I hadn't been solving a puzzle, I had been aligning myself. I had tuned my consciousness, my very perception, to its inescapable frequency. Every text, every symbol, every impossible pattern was not a message from it, but a resonance of it. I hadn't uncovered its secrets, I had merely made myself receptive to its overwhelming truth. It was not a creature, not a being with eyes or limbs or a will. It was a principle, a cosmic imperative, an absolute state of being that rendered all other realities insignificant. My sanity had not been attacked, it had simply been unable to withstand the sheer, unadulterated isness of it. The fragile architecture of my mind, built upon human logic and earthly perception, had simply crumbled under the weight of something so utterly other. I was not a victim of a malevolent force, but a casualty of proximity. My intelligence, my curiosity, my relentless pursuit of understanding had led me not to enlightenment, but to a profound, irreversible shattering. I was a vessel, now filled not with knowledge, but with the echo of an entity whose existence alone was a universe-rending truth. The world outside, the detective, the fading lights, they were all illusions, fragile constructs in the face of this incomprehensible, indifferent presence that now resonated within me, through me, as me. I was not Arthur anymore. I was merely a conduit, a broken bridge between two realities that were never meant to touch. It had been building, this internal vibration, since the first impossible glyphs had snaked their way into my consciousness. Now, it was a crescendo, a roaring tide within the confines of my mind. The earth beneath me was alive, not with roots and soil, but with the memory of rock and ore, of pressure and time. My vision blurred, not from tears, but from the overwhelming influx of information. My body began to shake, not with fear, but with a profound, resonant resonance. Each nerve ending sang a different note in a discordant symphony. I tried to speak, to call out a name, my name, but the sound caught in my throat, transforming into a guttural moan that felt alien, wrong. The words I once knew, the structures of language that had been my life's devotion, dissolved like sugar in water. They were inadequate, clumsy vessels for the vast, formless truth that was now consuming me. A sudden, sharp clarity pierced through the mental fog. It was not merely my mind breaking, it was being reforged. The old Arthur, the scholar who meticulously catalogued impossible texts, was being flayed, his skin peeled back to reveal the raw, pulsating core beneath. And that core was not human. I pushed myself up, my movements stiff, unnatural, as if my limbs were no longer truly mine, but articulated by an unseen puppeteer. The entrance to the abandoned mine loomed, a black maw that seemed to exhale the very essence of the entity. I felt drawn to it, not by will, but by an irresistible gravitational pull. Each step was a surrender, each breath a deeper inhalation of the pervasive pattern. My eyes, I knew, were changing. They felt less like windows to my soul and more like polished obsidian, reflecting not light, but the infinite, complex geometries that now danced behind my eyelids. The entity wasn't just in my mind, it was my mind. It was the whisper in the dark, the unseen architect, the silent, terrible truth. As I stood at the threshold of the mine, the very air around me seemed to crystallize, to hum with an unbearable tension. My blood, I imagined, no longer coursed with life, but with a slow, viscous current of pure, unadulterated pattern. I was no longer Arthur, the man of books in quiet contemplation. I was the book. I was the text. The pattern found its decipherers, its conduits, its vessels. I had been one. Now, I was the asterisk vessel. My purpose was not to understand, but to transmit. To stand, silent and still, a living monument to its alien existence, a beacon of its incomprehensible presence. The subtle tremors in the earth, the faint, resonant hum in the air, these were not just the mind settling, but the quiet, relentless hum of my new reality. My mind, shattered and integrated, was now a gateway, silently broadcasting the entity's signature into the world, waiting for the next curious mind to stumble upon a text, a glyph, a whisper in the dark, and begin the terrible journey anew. The abandoned mine, once a place of earthly extraction, was now a place of ethereal transmission, and I, its silent, unmoving core.